Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we journey through a story that reminds us how fragile life can be, how complex human relationships become, and how the truth eventually finds its way into the light. This is the story of Andreen McDonald, a woman who traveled thousands of miles to build a dream, who created something meaningful from nothing, and whose light was extinguished far too soon. The island of Jamaica holds a special kind of magic, warm breezes that carry the scent of hibiscus and salt water, colors so vibrant they seem painted by an artist's hand. It was here that Andreen Nicole McDonald was born in 1979, into a world that would shape her into a woman of remarkable determination and grace. Growing up in Jamaica, Andreen learned early what it meant to work hard. Her family wasn't wealthy, but they were rich in the things that mattered: love, faith, and the belief that with enough persistence, anything was possible. She carried these values like a compass throughout her life. As a young woman, Andreen possessed a beauty that turned heads, but it was her mind that truly set her apart. She was intelligent, driven, and possessed an entrepreneurial spirit that burned bright. She dreamed of building something lasting, something that would make a difference in people's lives. In the early 2000s, Andreen made a decision that would change everything. She would leave Jamaica and move to the United States, not just for opportunity, but for love. She had met a man named Andre McDonald, and their connection seemed destined to become something permanent. Andre was different from Andreen in many ways. Where she was warm and expressive, he was more reserved, analytical. He served in the United States Air Force, a career that demanded discipline and precision. To those who knew him casually, Andre seemed like a solid, dependable man, the kind of person who followed rules and maintained order in his life. The couple married and eventually settled in San Antonio, Texas, a sprawling city where military culture blended with Southern hospitality and vibrant Hispanic traditions. They purchased a home in a quiet neighborhood on the north side of the city, on a street called Ansley Terrace. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved to each other, where children rode bikes on warm evenings, where life seemed safe and predictable. Andreen and Andre had a daughter together, a little girl who became the center of Andreen's universe. Being a mother transformed her in the way it transforms so many women. It gave her purpose and even sharper focus. Everything she did, every dream she pursued, was now also for her child. But motherhood didn't slow Andreen down. If anything, it accelerated her ambitions. In 2016, Andreen launched a business that would become her greatest professional achievement: Starlight Homes Assisted Living. It was more than just a business venture. It was a calling. Andreen understood that society's most vulnerable members, the elderly and those with special needs, deserve dignity, compassion, and excellent care. She started small, but through sheer force of will and an unwavering commitment to quality, Starlight Homes grew. Andreen worked tirelessly, often putting in 12 to 14-hour days. She hired staff carefully, trained them personally, and built a reputation for providing care that felt like family. The business flourished. Within just a few years, Starlight Homes was generating revenue in the millions annually. Andreen had done it. She had built something from nothing, created jobs and improved lives. She was living proof that the American dream wasn't just a myth. Those who knew Andreen during this time remember a woman who seemed to have boundless energy. She would show up at her facilities at all hours, checking on residents, ensuring standards were met. She attended church regularly, maintaining the faith that had sustained her since childhood. She posted on social media, sharing glimpses of her life, her business successes, moments with her daughter, inspirational quotes that reflected her optimistic worldview. To the outside world, Andreen MacDonald had it all: a successful business, a beautiful home, a family, and a future bright with possibility. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Cracks that would eventually shatter everything. No marriage is perfect. Every couple faces challenges, navigates disagreements, and works through difficult seasons. But what was happening in the MacDonald household went beyond normal marital strain. By 2019, the relationship between Andreen and Andre had deteriorated significantly. What had once been a partnership had become something darker, more complicated. There were arguments about money, about time, about priorities. Andre seemed to resent Andreen's success, her independence, the way her business consumed so much of her attention. Friends noticed changes in Andreen. She seemed more stressed, more withdrawn. The ever-present smile appeared less frequently. She confided in a few trusted individuals that things at home were difficult, that Andre's behavior had become concerning. There were allegations of infidelity, whispers that Andre had been involved with other women, that he had strayed from his marriage vows. For Andreen, who valued loyalty and commitment deeply, this betrayal cut to the bone. But she didn't give up easily. Andreen was a fighter. She suggested counseling, tried to find ways to rebuild what had been broken. She focused on her daughter, on providing stability even as her own world felt increasingly unstable. Then came February of 2019, a month that would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. On Thursday, February 28th, Andreen went about her day as usual. She checked on her assisted living facilities, handled business matters, sent text messages to staff and friends. To anyone paying attention, it was just another busy day in a busy life. But that evening, something happened. Something terrible. Andreen returned home to the house on Ansley Terrace. What transpired behind those closed doors would later be pieced together by investigators, testimony, and evidence. But in the moment, it remained hidden, known only to two people. By Friday, March 1st, Andreen MacDonald had vanished. When someone disappears, there's often a period of confusion. Friends and family wonder if maybe the person just needed space, went on an impromptu trip, or had a reasonable explanation for being out of contact. But with Andreen, alarm bells rang immediately. She wasn't answering her phone. She hadn't shown up to work. Something completely out of character for a woman who treated her business like her baby. She hadn't picked up her daughter or made arrangements for her care. Something was very wrong. Andre reported Andreen missing on that Friday, March 1st. He told authorities that he had last seen his wife the previous evening, that they had gotten into an argument, and that she had left the house. He claimed he didn't know where she had gone. The Bexar County Sheriff's Office took the report seriously. A woman with no history of disappearing, with a young daughter and thriving business, doesn't just vanish without explanation. Deputies began investigating immediately. They interviewed Andre extensively. His story had inconsistencies, details that didn't quite add up. He seemed nervous, evasive. When investigators asked to search the property, he consented, but his demeanor raised red flags. The MacDonald home on Ansley Terrace became a crime scene, though no body had been found. Forensic teams swept through the residence, looking for any evidence that might explain Andreen's disappearance. And they found things that troubled them deeply. There were signs of a struggle, blood evidence in areas of the home, attempts at cleanup that hadn't been entirely successful. The forensic patterns suggested something violent had occurred inside that house. As investigators dug deeper into Andre's background and activities, the picture became even more disturbing. They discovered that he had made several purchases after Andre disappeared. He had bought heavy-duty garbage bags, citrus trip, a powerful paint and varnish remover, cleaning supplies, and a shovel. His vehicle, a large SUV, was examined forensically. Inside, investigators found traces of Andreen's blood. They also found burn marks and evidence that suggested items had been transported and disposed of. Andre's movements in the days following Andreen's disappearance were tracked. Cell phone records showed he had traveled to a rural area north of San Antonio, near the small community of Bulverde. It was rugged hill country terrain, limestone outcroppings, dense brush, hidden ravines, the kind of landscape where something could be concealed for a very long time. On March 23rd, 3 weeks after Andrin disappeared, deputies conducted a massive search of a remote area off County Road 11523. Dozens of law enforcement personnel combed through the brush, looking for any sign of the missing woman. And then they found her. Andrin's remains were discovered in a field, partially burned and concealed in the brush. The location was exactly where Andre's cell phone data had placed him in the days after her disappearance. The woman who had built so much, who had worked so hard, who had loved so deeply, reduced to remains in a desolate field. The discovery confirmed what investigators had suspected. Andreen McDonald hadn't disappeared. She had been murdered. With Andreen's body recovered, the investigation shifted into a new phase. The question was no longer whether a crime had occurred, but rather how to build an airtight case against the person they believed responsible. Andre McDonald was arrested and charged with his wife's murder. He was taken into custody, and the details of what investigators had uncovered began to emerge. The evidence painted a damning picture. According to prosecutors, Andre had killed Andreen during an argument at their home on the evening of February 28th. The exact nature of the argument and the precise method of death would be debated, but the outcome was indisputable. Andreen had died, and Andre had attempted to cover up the crime. After killing his wife, investigators believed Andre had worked to dispose of her body. He had purchased supplies designed to aid in concealment and cleanup. He had transported Andreen's remains to the remote location in Bulverde. He had attempted to burn the body to destroy evidence, and then he had reported her missing, playing the role of concerned husband while knowing exactly what had happened. The prosecution's case was built on multiple pillars of evidence. The forensic findings in the home showing blood and signs of violence. The purchases Andre made after Andreen's death. The blood found in his vehicle, the cell phone data placing him at the disposal site, and the discovery of Andreen's remains in that exact location. But Andre maintained his innocence. Through his attorneys, he denied killing his wife. He suggested alternative explanations, though none that adequately explained the totality of evidence arrayed against him. The case moved slowly through the legal system, as murder cases often do. There were hearings, motions, delays. Andreen's family and friends waited for justice, their grief compounded by the agonizing pace of the judicial process. The community of San Antonio followed the case closely. Andreen had been a respected businesswoman, a member of the community who had contributed positively to the lives of so many. Her death felt like a collective loss. Her daughter, now without a mother, was cared for by family members. The assisted living business Andreen had built with such dedication continued operating, though without its founder's guiding hand. Starlight Homes stood as a living monument to Andreen's vision and hard work. Years passed. Andre remained incarcerated, awaiting trial. The wheels of justice turned slowly, deliberately. In April of 2022, more than 3 years after Jordan's murder, the case finally went to trial. A jury of 12 citizens was tasked with reviewing the evidence and determining Andre McDonald's guilt or innocence. The trial laid bare the details of a marriage that had crumbled, of financial disputes and infidelity, of anger and violence. Prosecutors walked the jury through the evidence methodically. The blood, the purchases, the phone data, the burned remains. Defense attorneys attempted to create reasonable doubt, suggesting that perhaps the evidence wasn't as clear as prosecutors claimed, that alternative explanations existed. But the sheer weight of evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated, weighing what they had heard and seen. They examined photographs, reviewed testimony, discussed the case from every angle. The decision they reached would determine whether Andre McDonald would spend the rest of his life in prison, or potentially walk free. In the end, the verdict came back. Guilty of murder. Andre McDonald was convicted of killing his wife. Andrin. The jury had found that the evidence proved beyond reasonable doubt that he had taken her life and attempted to hide his crime. Sentencing followed. The judge handed down a lengthy prison term, ensuring that Andre would spend decades behind bars for what he had done. While no sentence could bring Andre back or heal the wounds her loss had created, it represented a measure of justice. For Andreen's family, the verdict brought a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that the legal process had concluded, that Andre had been held accountable, but also profound sadness because no verdict, no sentence could restore what had been taken from them. Andrian's mother, her siblings, her friends, they all had to find ways to move forward while carrying the weight of her absence. Her daughter would grow up without a mother, knowing her only through photographs and stories, through the legacy Andrian left behind. When we think about true crime, it's easy to focus on the violence, the investigation, the trial. These are the dramatic elements that capture attention. But behind every case is a real person whose life was cut short, whose dreams were left unfulfilled, whose absence creates a void that can never be filled. Andrian McDonald was 39 years old when she died. 39 years of living, loving, building, dreaming, ended in an act of violence in her own home, by someone who had promised to cherish her. She left behind tangible legacies, the assisted living facilities that continued serving vulnerable populations, the business model she had created, the standards of care she had implemented. These things outlived her, continuing to make a positive difference in the world. But she also left intangible legacies that perhaps matter even more. She left the memory of her determination, her refusal to accept limitations, her belief that hard work and faith could overcome any obstacle. She left an example of entrepreneurship and community service that inspired others. Those who knew Adren speak of her warmth, her generosity, her infectious optimism. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who checked on friends when they were struggling, who celebrated others' successes as enthusiastically as her own. She had come from humble beginnings in Jamaica and built an empire in Texas. She had navigated the challenges of immigration, of starting over in a new country, of competing in a difficult industry. She had succeeded not by compromising her values, but by holding fast to them. The tragedy of Andredine's death is compounded by its preventability. Domestic violence, which is what this ultimately was, claims far too many lives. Women are killed by intimate partners at alarming rates, often after escalating patterns of conflict and control. Andrian's story reminds us of the importance of reaching out, of not suffering in silence, of seeking help when relationships become dangerous. It reminds us that success and strength in one area of life doesn't protect us from vulnerability in another. It reminds us that behind closed doors in homes that look peaceful from the outside, terrible things can unfold. But it also reminds us that victims of violence deserve to be remembered for who they were, not just how they died. Andrian McDonald was a successful entrepreneur, a devoted mother, a faithful Christian, a loyal friend, and a dreamer who made her dreams reality. That's who she was. That's how she should be remembered. In San Antonio, her name is still spoken with respect and sadness. The assisted living community she served remembers the woman who cared so deeply about their well-being. Her business associates remember her professionalism and vision. Her friends remember her laughter and kindness. And somewhere, a young girl grows older each day, carrying her mother's genes and hopefully her mother's strength, learning about the remarkable woman who gave her life and who built something meaningful in the time she had. As you lie here in the darkness, letting this story settle over you like a blanket, consider what it teaches us about the fragility of life, the complexity of human relationships, and the importance of justice. Andrian McDonald's life was a testament to what's possible when talent meets determination. Her death was a reminder of what we lose when violence intrudes upon that potential. The man who killed her sits in prison now, his own life effectively over, traded for a few moments of rage or calculation or whatever motivated the act that ended everything. It's a profound waste, 2 lives destroyed. A child left motherless, family shattered, communities grieved, but justice was served. The truth emerged from the shadows. Andrian's story was told in full in a courtroom where 12 citizens listened and understood and decided that accountability mattered. In the end, that's what we can hope for in these darkest of stories. That the truth will out, that justice will prevail, that victims will be remembered. Not just as victims, but as full, complete human beings who mattered, who contributed, who loved and were loved. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're going to walk through a story together. A story about ambition, family, and the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary moments. This is the story of Jared Bridgen. Picture Jacksonville, Florida. The sun sets early in February, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples over the Atlantic coast. It's a place where families gather, where children play in parks near the ocean, where life moves at a gentle southern pace. In this city, in 2022, lived a man named Jared Galen Bridgen. He was 33 years old. A father, a designer, a dreamer. Jared wasn't born in Florida, though. His story began much farther inland, in Warrensburg, Missouri, on June 29, 1988. His parents, Gaylord and Joanne Bridgen, raised him with 2 siblings in a close-knit family. When Jared was young, the Bridgens moved to Jacksonville, where the boy would grow up under the Florida sun. From an early age, Jared showed an artistic soul. He attended the Douglas Anderson School of the Arts, a magnet school in Jacksonville where creative minds gathered to study music, visual arts, and theater. Jared found his passion there, in design, in visual storytelling, in the way light and color and motion could speak without words. After high school, he traveled west to Utah, where he enrolled at Utah Valley University. In 2014, he graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in digital media, with an emphasis in cinema production. He was learning to see the world through a lens, to understand how images could move people, how design could shape experiences. His career began quietly, as most careers do. He worked as a user experience designer, a role that asks you to think about how people interact with the digital world. How does a button feel when you press it? How does a website welcome you or push you away? These were the questions Jared pondered. He worked at a company called Canopy as a senior UX designer. Then he moved to Web.com, where he became director of user experience. His skills were growing. His reputation was building. Eventually, he joined a Utah-based company called Clean Simple Eats as chief technology officer, helping to shape the entire technical direction of the business. And then came Microsoft, one of the largest technology companies in the world. Jared became a senior design manager there, working remotely from Florida, managing teams, creating digital experiences that millions of people would touch. But this isn't really a story about career success, because behind every career, behind every accomplishment, there's something more important. There's family, there's love, there's the messy, complicated business of building a life with other people. And that's where our story truly begins. In 2010, when Jared was 21 years old, he married for the first time. Her name was Shauna Gardner, and they wed in Salt Lake City, Utah. In April of that year, Jared was young, hopeful, in love. The couple settled into married life, and soon they had children, twins, a boy and a girl. Abby and Liam, born into a young family that seemed, from the outside, to have everything ahead of them. But marriages are delicate things. They require patience, communication, compromise. And sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, they crack. The exact details of what went wrong between Jared and Shauna aren't for us to fully know. What we do know is that by 2015, after 5 years of marriage, the relationship had fractured beyond repair. Shauna filed for divorce in February of that year. Now, many divorces, even difficult ones, eventually find equilibrium. Parents learn to coexist for their children. They create routines, build trust, move forward separately but respectfully. This was not one of those divorces. The court file that documented Jared and Shauna's separation would eventually grow to more than 800 pages, more than 300 entries and motions. They communicated primarily through their lawyers in the court system. There were accusations. Shauna claimed Jared showed disturbing and abusive behavior toward their children. Jared accused her of spying on him, of treating him with contempt in front of the twins. One court document would later state, "The parenting plan is clearly an issue and the parents are unable to agree." The disagreement of the parents at this point now extends well beyond mere time sharing and goes to issues of the mental health and well-being of the children. They appeared in court annually, sometimes more often. Custody battles, financial disputes. The twins caught in between, shuttled back and forth between two homes, two lives, two versions of their story. It was exhausting. It was expensive. It was corrosive. But Jared tried to move forward. He had to. For his children, if nothing else. Sometimes life gives us second chances. In 2017, Jared met a woman named Kirsten. She was from Charlotte, North Carolina. And they connected through a dating app, the modern way that so many love stories begin now, with a swipe and a message and a hope. Kirsten was different from his first marriage. Friends and family would later describe their relationship as filled with respect, with laughter, with genuine partnership. They married that same year, and they built a family. In August of 2019, their first daughter was born. They named her Bexley. 2 years later, in August of 2021, they welcomed another daughter, London. Jared now had 4 children he adored. The twins Abby and Liam, who he shared custody of with Shauna, and his 2 daughters with Kirsten, Bexley, and London. Those who knew Jared said he lived for his children. He was the kind of father who would spend hours setting up elaborate activities, building forts, creating treasure hunts, taking them on adventures. When it rained, he'd make little toothpick boats with them and watch them sail down the gutters in the street. Kirsten would later tell reporters he was the best dad. Whenever I needed a break, he would scoop up the kids, take them outside, and give me a minute to catch my breath. The Bridegans made their home in St. Augustine, Florida, a historic coastal city just south of Jacksonville. It was picturesque, peaceful, a place where Jared could work remotely for Microsoft while being present for his young family. But every other week, like clockwork, Jared had to make a drive, north to Jacksonville Beach, to the home where his ex-wife Shauna now lived, because that's where the twins spent their alternating weeks. Shauna had remarried too. In 2018, she met a man named Mario Fernandez Saldana at her CrossFit gym, where he worked as a maintenance man. They married and they lived together in a neighborhood called the Sanctuary in Jacksonville Beach. And so the routine was established. Every other week, Jared would drive up to Jacksonville Beach. He'd pick up the twins and take them back to St. Augustine for his week with them. Then, a week later, he'd drive them back north, drop them off at Shauna's house, and return home, back and forth, week after week, month after month. It was a routine everyone knew, a path everyone could predict, and that predictability, that would become important. Let's talk about February 16th, 2022. It was a Wednesday. The sun was setting earlier now the way it does in winter, even in Florida. Jared had the twins that day. He decided to take them out for what they called date night. Just dad and the twins, spending quality time together. They went out for dinner, and afterward, ice cream, simple pleasures, the kind of evening that builds memories. His 2-year-old daughter Bexley came along too, strapped into her car seat in the back of Jared's Volkswagen Atlas. She was too young to fully understand the dynamic, the back and forth, the complexity. To her, it was just a car ride with Daddy and her older siblings. The evening went well. Jared seemed happy when he called Kirsten on the drive. She was at home with their infant daughter, London. Jared was on the phone with Kirsten and her brother, and Bexley's little voice piped up from the back seat. "Mom, I got an ice cream." It was a good night. Jared sounded content. Around 7:45 in the evening, Jared arrived at Shauna's house in the Sanctuary neighborhood of Jacksonville Beach. He dropped off the twins, Abby and Liam. They said goodbye. The twins went inside to their mother's house. Their week with Dad was over. Jared got back in the car with Bexley still in her seat behind him. He needed to drive home now, back to St. Augustine, back to Kirsten and baby London. The drive would take maybe 30-35 minutes, if traffic was light. To leave the Sanctuary neighborhood, Jared would take the route he always took. Sanctuary Boulevard, a narrow, dimly lit residential street that wound through the quiet neighborhood toward the main road. It was the same path he'd driven dozens of times before, maybe more than 100 times. every other week for years now. Everyone knew this route. Anyone watching would know it too. Jared turned onto Sanctuary Boulevard. His headlights cut through the gathering darkness. The street was empty, residential homes sitting quiet on either side. And then there in the road ahead, something that didn't belong. A tire, just sitting there in the middle of the narrow street, blocking his path. Jared slowed his Volkswagen Atlas. He put on his hazard lights. He came to a stop. In the back seat, Bexley sat in her car seat, probably tired from the evening. Maybe playing with a toy, maybe already drowsy. She was 2 years old, safe in her father's car. Jared opened his driver's side door. The interior light came on. He stepped out into the street to move the tire, to clear the path so he could continue home. He walked toward the tire, and that's when the darkness erupted. Gunshots shattered the quiet street. Multiple shots fired at close range. The muzzle flashes bright in the dimness, the sound echoing off the houses. Jared Bryden was struck several times. He fell beside his vehicle, near the open driver's door, near the tire he'd been moving to clear his path home. Some of the bullets that missed him passed through the Volkswagen Atlas, through the metal and glass, inches from where Bexley sat, strapped in her car seat. Inches. The shooter disappeared into the darkness as quickly as they'd appeared. No one saw them arrive. No one saw them leave. Just gunshots, and then silence, and then the horrible aftermath. Inside the car, little Bexley began to cry. She was calling for her daddy, but her daddy couldn't answer anymore. At approximately 8 p.m., 911 calls started coming into the Jacksonville Beach Police Department. Multiple callers reported hearing gunshots in the Sanctuary neighborhood. Some reported seeing a vehicle stopped in the road with its hazard lights on. One caller would discover the scene. A man lying in the street beside an SUV. A young child crying in the back seat. Police and emergency responders arrived within minutes. But there was nothing they could do for Jared. He was pronounced dead at the scene. 33 years old, a father of 4, a husband, a son, a brother. Little Bexley was carefully removed from the car, physically unharmed but traumatized. She'd watched her father die. She would have to live with that memory for the rest of her life. At the Jacksonville Beach Police Department, officers waited with Bexley until her mother could arrive. They did their best to comfort her, but what do you say to a 2-year-old in those circumstances? What toys or blankets or gentle words can make that okay? Kristen Brightigan received a call that night. At first it was Jared's phone ringing, which seemed normal enough. But when she answered, it wasn't Jared's voice on the line. It was a police officer, asking her to come to the police station. She knew something was terribly wrong. In her rush to get there, she barely thought about what to bring, what Bexley might need. She just drove, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. When she arrived, when they told her, the world stopped making sense. The next time somebody answered Jared's phone, she would later recall, it was a police officer. From the very beginning, police knew this wasn't random. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong, or a case of mistaken identity or road rage. The tire in the street, that was deliberate. Someone had placed it there knowing Jared would have to stop, knowing he would get out of his car. Jacksonville Beach Police Chief Gene Paul Smith would later say, the tire was purposely placed there to make him stop, which he did. Tragically, he began to exit his vehicle to move the tire, and he was gunned down in cold blood. This was a planned ambush, a targeted killing. But who would want Jared Brightigan dead, and why? Investigators began interviewing family, friends, co-workers. They canvassed the neighborhood for security camera footage. They searched for witnesses. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. Security cameras from nearby businesses captured images of a dark blue Ford F-150 truck in the area. Around the time of the murder, a 4-door truck with running boards, brown trim, and a silver toolbox. Police released images of this truck to the public, asking for help identifying it or its owner. Tips began coming in, but the investigation moved carefully, methodically. The police and the state attorney's office knew they were building a case for murder, and they couldn't afford mistakes. Meanwhile, the Brightigan family was left with grief and questions. Kirsten was now a widow with 2 young daughters to raise alone. The twins, Abby and Liam, had lost their father. Jared's parents, Gaylord and Joanne, had lost their son. At vigils and memorial services, people gathered to remember Jared. They described him as kind, creative, devoted to his children. They couldn't understand who would do this, or why. Kirsten spoke to the media, pleading for information. His kids deserve to know why their dad is not here, she said, her voice breaking. They need answers, and I can't give them to them by myself. Weeks passed, then months. Publicly, it seemed like the case might be going cold, but behind the scenes, investigators were following threads, building connections, gathering evidence, and they were looking very carefully at the people closest to Jared, including his ex-wife Shauna and her husband Mario. In August of 2022, 6 months after the murder, a man named Henry Arthur Tenen was arrested, but not for Jared's murder, at least not yet. He was pulled over and charged with possession of a weapon by a felon and driving with a suspended license. Routine charges, but they gave police a reason to bring him in, to question him, to take a closer look. Tenen was 61 years old with a criminal history. He drove a dark blue Ford F-150 truck, the same kind of truck that had been seen near the crime scene. When officers went to the home Tenen was renting, they noticed something, a truck tire, leaning against the house. But there was no truck in the driveway. They took the tire, examined it, compared it to the tire that had been left in the road on Sanctuary Boulevard the night Jared was killed. The match was extraordinary. Both tires had the same DOT numbers, same manufacturing date. They'd been made in the same facility during the same week in November of 2018. The 47th week of that year, specifically. But there was something even more interesting about Henry Tenen. The home he was renting, it was owned by Mario Fernandez Saldana, Shauna Gardner's husband. Investigators dug deeper. They pulled phone records, and what they found was striking. In February of 2022, the month Jared was killed, there were 35 phone contacts between Tenen and Fernandez, 30 more contacts in March, then several more in May and June. Why would a landlord and tenant need to communicate that frequently, especially right around the time of a murder? Then investigators found the checks. 3 handwritten checks from Mario Fernandez to Henry Tenen, totaling $10,000, $2,000, $3,000, $5,000, cashed in late March and early April of 2022, just weeks after Jared's death. The web was tightening. On January 25th, 2023, almost 11 months after Jared's murder, the Jacksonville Beach Police Department held a press conference. Chief Gene Paul Smith stood before the cameras and announced, "Just under an hour ago, this man Henry Tenen was arrested. The charges were serious: conspiracy to commit murder, second-degree murder with a weapon, accessory after the fact to a capital felony, and child abuse. The child abuse charge was because of little Bexley's presence in the car that night, but State Attorney Melissa Nelson made something very clear. We know Mr. Tenen did not act alone. This wasn't just one man with a gun. This was a conspiracy." At first, Tenen pleaded not guilty, but in March of 2023, he changed his plea. He admitted to being the gunman. He confessed to pulling the trigger that night on Sanctuary Boulevard, and he agreed to testify against the people who he claimed had hired him. On March 16, 2023, the same day Tenen pleaded guilty, another arrest was made. Mario Fernandez Saldana, age 34, was taken into custody in Orlando. He was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation to commit a capital felony, and child abuse. Prosecutors alleged that Mario had orchestrated the entire plot, that he'd hired his tenant, Henry Tenen, to kill his wife's ex-husband, that the planning had begun months before the actual murder, back in November of 2021. According to investigators, there had even been a practice run. Cell phone data showed that on an earlier date, Tenen had driven through the Sanctuary neighborhood, following the route Jared would take, timing it out, rehearsing. But there was still one more arrest to come. And this one would shock even those who had been following the case closely. On August 17th, 2023, 17 months after Jared's death, authorities announced that Shauna Gardner Fernandez had been arrested in Washington State, where she'd been living with her parents and the twins since shortly after the murder. A grand jury had indicted her on the same charges as her husband: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation to commit a capital felony, and child abuse. State Attorney Melissa Nelson said, Shanna Gardner's indictment acknowledges her central and key role in the cold, calculated, and premeditated murder of Jared Brydon. According to the investigation, Shanna had been tired of the custody arrangement, tired of sharing the twins with Jared, the constant court battles, the back and forth, the co-parenting with a man she clearly despised. She wanted it to end, and investigators alleged that she and Mario had decided to end it permanently. A friend of Shanna's would later tell police about a disturbing conversation. According to this friend, Shanna had once mentioned that Mario had a military background and could get people to break into Brydon's house in the middle of the night to take care of him, and no one would ever know. Shanna had apparently laughed about it, treated it as a joke, but it wasn't a joke. Text messages between Shanna and this friend allegedly referenced hiring a hitman. The friend said Shanna used code words, like funeral, potatoes casserole, when discussing Jared's potential death. After Tenen was arrested in January of 2023, Shanna allegedly called her public relations firm in Utah. In that call, prosecutors claimed she admitted to knowing Henry Tenen, saying she'd met him 5 years earlier, but insisted there shouldn't be any paperwork connecting her to the rental property he'd lived in. The PR firm apparently told her they should stop talking about it over the phone. Both Shanna and Mario pleaded not guilty. They hired prominent defense attorneys. Shanna's lawyer was Jose Baez, famous for defending Casey Anthony. The prosecution announced they would seek the death penalty for both defendants. As the case moved through the courts, complications arose. In early 2025, Henry Tenen, the confessed gunman, began changing his story. He claimed his testimony had been false. He said he wanted to withdraw his guilty plea. This created chaos. Without Tenen's testimony, the prosecution's case against Shanna and Mario became more difficult, though not impossible. They still had the phone records, the financial transactions, the tire evidence, the cell phone location data, but a witness recanting is never good for prosecutors. Legal battles erupted over privileged communications, over evidence, over whether certain information should be admissible at trial. Defense attorneys argued the state had accessed attorney-client communications and should be disqualified from the case. Judges held hearing after hearing, and then in November of 2025, just 3 years after Jared's death, the state attorney's office made an unexpected announcement. They were withdrawing their intent to seek the death penalty. This decision came with the full support of Kirsten Brydon and Jared's family. In a statement, Kirsten explained that while they believed in accountability, pursuing a death sentence would likely prolong the case for years through appeals, extending the trauma for Jared's 4 children. She wrote that the choice reflected compassion for the children, not for the defendants. She condemned what she described as the killer's lack of mercy. The trial was scheduled for August of 2026, with pre-trial hearings continuing through the end of the year. While the legal proceedings dragged on, another battle was being fought, a custody battle. After Shanna's arrest, her parents Sterling and Shelley Gardner took custody of the twins, Abby and Liam. The children, now 12 years old, remained in Washington state with their maternal grandparents. But Jared's parents, Gaylord and Joanne Brydon, wanted visitation rights. They wanted to see their grandchildren, to maintain a connection to the twins who had lost their father so violently. The Gardners initially resisted. There were allegations that they'd helped Shanna flee Florida after the murder. There were claims they were preventing the twins from having any contact with Jared's widow, Kirsten, or their half-siblings Bexley and London. According to Jared's family, they'd only had one supervised visit with the twins, and weekly video calls in the years since his death. In December of 2024, a court ruled that it was in the twins' best interest to remain in Washington with their maternal grandparents. The custody case was put on hold pending the outcome of the murder trial. So the 4 siblings, the twins Abby and Liam, and their younger half-sisters Bexley and London, remained separated. Different states, different families, different versions of their father's story. In September of 2022, in the depths of her grief, Kirsten Brydon founded the Brydon Foundation in Jared's honor. The foundation created something called the Bexley Box, named after the little girl who'd been in the car that terrible night. These boxes are donated to police departments and sheriff's offices, first in Florida and then around the country. Each Bexley box contains comfort items for children experiencing trauma, toys, sippy cups, diapers in various sizes, blankets, stuffed animals, pre-mixed formula, the kinds of things that might help a child who's been through something terrible, who's waiting at a police station for family to arrive, who needs something soft to hold on to in the worst moment of their life. Kirsten remembered that night rushing to the police station to get Bexley, not thinking about what to bring, not knowing how long they'd be there. She thought about what her daughter had needed, what other children in similar situations might need. I think Jared would be really proud that we're doing something good, that we're helping other people, Kirsten said. He really enjoyed helping people, so I think he would be really proud of this. And proud that we would have a part in something positive, that his death wouldn't just be the tragedy, there would be something good coming from that, and that would give him some peace. The foundation also advocated for better lighting in the area where Jared was killed. Eventually, lights were installed on that section of Sanctuary Boulevard, so the street wouldn't be so dark, so vulnerable, so perfect for an ambush. Small victories in the midst of an unfathomable loss. As I bring this story to a close, as you drift towards sleep, there are questions still unanswered. Will the trial bring justice? Will a jury believe the prosecution's theory that Shauna and Mario conspired to kill Jared? Or will the defense create reasonable doubt? What will happen to the twins, Abby and Liam, who've lost their father and whose mother and stepfather stand accused of orchestrating his murder? How do you process that as a child? How do you make sense of it? Will Henry Tennant maintain his guilty plea and testify, or will his recantation derail the case? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, was there a way this could have been prevented? In all those years of bitter custody disputes, in all those court appearances and arguments, could anyone have seen this coming? Could anyone have intervened before it was too late? Jared Bragan was 33 years old when he died. He was a father who built toothpick boats in the rain with his children, a designer who thought about how people experience the digital world, a man trying to navigate the complications of divorce and blended families and co-parenting. He shouldn't have died on a dark street, ambushed while trying to move a tire, killed in front of his toddler daughter. But he did, and now his story becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked hatred, about the corrosive power of custody battles, about the lengths some people will allegedly go to in order to get what they want. As you close your eyes tonight, think about the fragility of life. Think about the routines we follow, the paths we travel, the predictability that makes us vulnerable. And think about Jared's children, Abby, Liam, Bexley, and London, who will grow up without their father, who will carry this story with them for the rest of their lives. May they find peace, may they find healing, and may the truth, whatever it is, finally come to light. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we're traveling to Scotland, to a quiet town called Dunfermline in Fife, where the winter of 2014 brought darkness that no one expected. This is a story about a mother's love, about trust betrayed, and about how the people closest to us can sometimes harbor the deepest secrets. Carol Taggart was 54 years old in December of 2014. She had lived her entire adult life in Dunfermline, a historic town in the Kingdom of Fife, where ancient abbeys cast long shadows and cobblestone streets whispered stories centuries old. Carol was the kind of woman everyone knew, warm, reliable, the type who remembered your birthday and always had time to listen. She ran a small child mining business from her home on Hill of St. Margaret, a residential street named after Scotland's beloved medieval queen. Parents trusted Carol with their children, which is perhaps the greatest trust one person can give another. Among her young charges was even the daughter of the local member of parliament. That's how well regarded she was in the community. Carol had been married to a man named Sean, her partner in life. She had 3 children, including a daughter named Lorraine and a son named Ross. To understand what happened to Carol, you need to understand Ross, because this story, at its heart, is about the relationship between a mother and her son. Ross Taggart was 30 years old in 2014. He still lived at home with his mother in that house on Hill of St. Margaret. Friends and family had a particular way of describing Ross's place in Carol's heart. They called him her blue-eyed boy, her golden child, the one she would do anything for. But something had been changing in that house. Something dark had been growing for years, hidden behind closed doors and forced smiles. To understand how we arrived at December 2014, we need to go back further, back to when Ross was younger, to when the first cracks began to show. When Ross was 17, something happened that revealed the tension brewing in the household. Carol had to ask him to leave. It was temporary, but it was significant. She had reached a breaking point, if only briefly, because Ross had started stealing from the family. Small things at first, perhaps, then bigger things. Money, personal items, the kind of behavior that erodes trust slowly, like water wearing away stone. Ross's father had died in an accident when Ross was in his late teens. Grief affects people differently. Some grow closer to their remaining family. Others spiral. Ross seemed to change after his father's death. The stealing continued. The arguments intensified. Carol's daughter Lorraine watched this unfold. She saw her mother constantly defending Ross, constantly making excuses, constantly choosing him, even when his behavior hurt everyone else. It created a wedge between Carol and Lorraine. Eventually, Carol's relationship with Lorraine's father deteriorated completely, fractured by the constant stress of Ross's actions and Carol's unwillingness to truly hold him accountable. Lorraine described her mother as a very stubborn lady, and in her stubbornness, Carol believed that love could fix Ross, that if she just gave enough, sacrificed enough, stood by him enough, he would change. He would become the son she knew he could be. Instead, Ross was learning something else entirely. He was learning that he could manipulate his mother, that her love was unconditional, which meant he could take advantage of it without consequences. This is what experts call coercive control. It's a pattern of behavior designed to dominate another person through manipulation, isolation, and psychological pressure. We often think of it in romantic relationships, but it can happen between family members too. A child can control a parent, and in the Taggart household, Ross had been perfecting this control for years. By 2014, Lorraine had become estranged from her mother. The constant drama surrounding Ross had pushed her away. Carol and Ross lived together in that house on Hill of St. Margaret. Just the two of them. Ross was 30 years old with no apparent stable employment. Carol continued running her child-minding business, caring for other people's children, while her own adult son depended on her for everything. Those who knew them said Ross controlled Carol's life. He isolated her. He manipulated her finances. And Carol, ever devoted, had recently changed her will. She made Ross the executor of her estate and left him the bulk of her wealth, including the house and her business. It was worth approximately £500,000, £500,000, left to a son who had spent years taking from her. But something was about to change. In December of 2014, as Christmas approached and winter settled cold over Scotland, Carol finally reached another breaking point. Friends would later say they believed Carol had decided to stand up to Ross. Maybe she threatened to change her will back. Maybe she told him he needed to leave to get his own place, to finally grow up and take responsibility for his life. We'll never know exactly what words passed between them in those final hours. But we know that Ross realized his comfortable life, his control, his inheritance, all of it was about to slip away. And he couldn't let that happen. December 21st, 2014, 3 days before Christmas Eve. The house on Hill of St. Margaret was quiet that evening. Mother and son alone together as they had been so many nights before. But this night was different. Ross and Carol argued. He would later admit this much. They argued about his girlfriend, about Lorraine, about his father. The argument escalated. Perhaps Carol finally said the words Ross feared most. Perhaps she told him he was losing his inheritance. Perhaps she told him to leave. What happened next was brutal and final. Ross attacked his mother. He struck her repeatedly about the head. The prosecution would later say the weapon was unknown, but the violence was clear. Then he seized her by the throat. Whether with his hands or with some ligature, he compressed her airway. He strangled the woman who had given him life. The woman who had defended him for 30 years. The woman who loved him more than she loved herself. Carol Taggart died in her own home, killed by her own son in the house where she had raised him, where she had sheltered him, where she had forgiven him again and again. And then Ross Taggart did what he had always done. He lied. Within hours of killing his mother, Ross was already executing a plan. While Carol's body lay dead in their home, Ross went online. He contacted a woman on a dating website, a woman he'd been talking to who lived nearby in Dunfermline. He went to her house that same night. He was seeking sex, intimacy, connection, hours after murdering his mother. Then he took Carol's credit cards and went out. He went to Edinburgh, Scotland's capital, just across the Firth of Forth. He bought new trainers. He went to bars and ordered cocktails. He had meals at restaurants, all on his dead mother's money, all while her body lay wrapped in bedding and twine in the house they shared. The next day, December 22nd, he gathered his mother's jewelry, rings, bangles, pieces she had worn, pieces that held memories. He took them to a pawnbroker on Frederick Street in Edinburgh. He told the pawnbroker that his mother had left these items to him in her will. He pawned them for cash. Carol's friend Karen Fotheringham arrived at the house that morning for work. She was a child care assistant who helped Carol with the child minding business. But Carol's car wasn't there. Odd. Karen sent texts. No response. The voicemail was full. Very odd. Carol was never without her phone. Friends said it was glued to her ear. Ross came into the living room holding his mother's phone. Karen found this strange. Why would he have her phone if Carol had left? Ross told her that he and his mother had argued, that Carol had stormed out of the house, that she'd probably gone to their holiday caravan at Pettycure Bay, a caravan park on the coast near the village of Kinghorn. Karen went to check. She drove to Pettycure Bay. She found Carol's caravan, but Carol wasn't there. Now Karen was worried. She pressured Ross to report his mother missing. On December 26, 2014, Boxing Day, Ross Taggart walked into the Dunfermline police station. He reported his mother missing. He said they'd argued. He said she'd driven off in her car. He said he was worried because this was out of character for her. The police began treating it as a missing person case. They put out appeals. They searched. Carol's car was found nearby, parked on a residential street. Her purse was in the trunk, which struck everyone as odd. Carol wouldn't leave her purse in her trunk. She wouldn't leave her phone at home. None of it made sense. And the car was found in front of the house of the woman Ross had visited on the night of the murder, the woman from the dating website. Ross called his half-sister Lorraine on December 23rd. Lorraine would later testify about this call. She said Ross told her their mother was missing after an argument, but Lorraine noticed something that chilled her. Ross wasn't that upset. His tone was wrong. His concern seemed performative. When Lorraine said, "My mom wouldn't storm out of her own house," she was speaking a truth everyone who knew Carol understood. Carol didn't storm out. She didn't leave without her phone. She didn't abandon her child-minding responsibilities. This wasn't who she was. The police began to suspect that Carol Taggart wasn't missing. They began to suspect she was dead. And they began to look very carefully at Ross. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of Ross maintaining the charade. 3 weeks of him using his mother's money, living in her house, spinning his lie. On January 10th, 2015, police made a discovery at Pettycure Bay Caravan Park. It was winter, the park mostly empty, the wind coming cold off the Firth of Forth. The officers moved systematically through the site, checking every caravan, and then they found her. Carol Taggart's body was hidden in a void beneath a caravan. Not her own caravan, but one just 2 spaces away. She had been wrapped in bedding. Her body had been bound with twine, and she had been dead since December 21st. The night she argued with her son. The cold had preserved her to some degree, but the damage Ross had inflicted was clear. He had beaten her, he had strangled her, and then he had driven her body here to this caravan park, to this hiding place he had carefully selected, and concealed her as if she were nothing more than trash to be hidden away. Lorraine Bristow had to identify her mother's body, but Carol's face had been beaten so badly that identification by sight was impossible. Lorraine identified her mother by a small detail, a permanent mark. Carol had a purple rose tattooed on her wrist. That's how her daughter knew for certain she was looking at her mother's remains. Ross Taggart was arrested on January 13th, 2015, and charged with murder. The trial took place in November 2015 at the High Court in Edinburgh. It lasted 7 days. Ross Taggart pleaded not guilty. He maintained his innocence throughout, looking the jury in the eyes, and insisting he would never hurt his mother. "You ask anyone how much I care about my mom," he told the court. "I'd be the last person to lift my hands to my mom." But the evidence against him was overwhelming. The prosecution presented the timeline. The dating website contact on the night of the murder. The credit card usage in Edinburgh. The pawning of jewelry the very next day. The lies about Carol's whereabouts. The suspicious location of Carol's abandoned car. And the text messages Ross had sent to his girlfriend Ella Mackey on the morning of December 22nd. In those messages, sent in the early hours after he'd killed his mother, Ross had written about Carol as if she were still alive. He'd said she had left after their argument. He'd told Elena he was just fed up at her moaning about life, and that Carol had told him she wants to die. He'd written, "I was just like, get a grip, totally pissed off." The cold calculation of those messages chilled everyone who heard them. Ross was already constructing his narrative. While his mother's body was barely cold, Carol's friends and family testified. Her stepfather, Sean, called Ross the golden boy from the get-go, but he also confirmed the troubled relationship, the arguments that would last for days, the control Ross exerted over Carol. Karen Fotheringham, Carol's friend and colleague, told the court about Carol's phone, about how Carol was never without it, about how strange it was that Ross had the phone, about how impossible it was that Carol would have left without it. Lorraine testified about the phone call from Ross, about his lack of genuine emotion, about her certainty that her mother would never have behaved the way Ross claimed. Ross took the stand in his own defense. He admitted they'd argued. He claimed his mother had left on her own. He said he had never snapped in his life, and that everybody who knows me knows I don't have much of a temper. But then, under cross-examination, he admitted to weekly arguments with his mother that would last a couple of days. The jury heard about the tempestuous relationship, about Ross being put out of the house when he was 17, about the pattern of theft and manipulation. The evidence formed a clear picture. Ross Taggart had killed his mother when she finally threatened his comfortable existence. He had then methodically covered his tracks, reported her missing, and attempted to access her wealth. On November 20th, 2015, the jury returned their verdict: guilty of murder. Guilty of attempting to pervert the course of justice by concealing the body and staging a missing person report. Lord Hughes, the trial judge, looked down at Ross Taggart from the bench. His words carried the weight of disgust and disbelief. "You embarked on a calculated course of deceit by reporting her as missing to the police, and persistently lying about your actions," the judge said. "You have shown no regret or remorse, and continued to deny your involvement before the jury in the face of overwhelming and unanswerable evidence." He paused, then added something that everyone in the courtroom was thinking. "How you have lived with your conscience since you murdered your mother, I do not know." Ross Taggart was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 18 years. He would not be eligible for parole until 2033. At the earliest, he would be in his late 40s before he could even be considered for release. But the cruelty didn't end with the conviction, because Carol had made Ross the executor of her will. And under Scottish law at that time, there was no mechanism to automatically remove a convicted murderer from that position. Ross couldn't inherit anything. The law was clear about that. A person cannot profit from their crimes, but as executor, he retained control over everything. The house, the business, the personal possessions, the family photographs, every memory Lorraine had of her childhood with her mother. Lorraine wanted access to the house to collect sentimental items. Ross refused. From his prison cell, through his lawyers, he continued to control his mother's estate. He continued to exert power over the woman he had killed and the family he had destroyed. Lorraine and her husband Stephen started a petition. They called for Scottish law to be changed so that convicted murderers could not act as executors for their victims' estates. The petition gained over 60,000 signatures. People from across Scotland and beyond were outraged that Ross Taggart could continue to control anything related to Carol. For years, the battle continued. Lorraine fought not just with grief, but with bureaucracy. She couldn't access her mother's home. She had no photographs of herself as a child with her mother, because all the family albums were locked in that house, and Ross controlled access. Ross has control of the estate, everything that my mom owned and everything that my mom had, Lorraine said. So he got to deal with everything, even down to the little things. The little things. The photographs. The jewelry not pawned. The letters. The memories. All held hostage by a murderer. Lorraine's campaign didn't just make noise. It made change. The Scottish government took notice. Siobhan Brown, the Victims and Community Safety Minister, brought forward amendments to the Trusts and Succession Scotland Bill. The amendments were specifically crafted to address what happened to Carol Taggart and her family. The new law would allow courts to remove executors who had been convicted of murdering the person whose will they controlled. It would be retrospective, meaning it would apply to cases like Ross Taggart's that occurred before the law was passed. On February 5, 2024, nearly a decade after Carol's murder, the law came into force. Lorraine could finally begin the process of having Ross removed as executor. She could finally access her mother's home. She could finally reclaim the photographs and memories that had been locked away. It was a case of always fighting to try and change this law and help other people, Lorraine said, because she knew she wasn't the only victim's family dealing with this cruel loophole. There were others, and now, because Carol Taggart had died and because Lorraine Bristow had refused to give up, no other family would have to endure what they endured. The change came too late to give Lorraine back the lost years. Too late to ease the fresh grief that should have been allowed to settle naturally. But it came, and it mattered. Carol Taggart's death led to a change in the law. Her story helped protect other families. In that way, even in death, Carol was still taking care of others, still thinking of children, of families, of those who needed help. It's what she had always done. Let's take a moment to remember Carol as she was. Not as a victim, not as a cautionary tale, but as a person. Carol ran her child-minding business with care and dedication. Parents trusted her with their most precious possessions, their children. She created a safe environment at her home on Hill of St. Margaret. She had toys and activities. She had patience and warmth. She remembered birthdays and favorite snacks, and which child needed an extra hug on difficult days. She had a partner in Sean who loved her. She had a daughter in Lorraine who wanted a relationship with her. If only Carol had been able to break free from Ross's manipulation. She had that purple rose tattoo on her wrist. A small act of self-expression. A touch of beauty. We don't know the story behind that tattoo, but we can imagine. Maybe it represented something she loved. Maybe it was done on a whim with friends. Maybe it meant rebirth, resilience, hope. A purple rose, specific and chosen, carried on her skin as a permanent reminder of something that mattered to her. Carol was 54 when she died. She should have had decades left. She should have watched grandchildren grow. She should have traveled, retired, found peace after years of struggle with Ross. She should have been able to grow old with Sean, to reconnect with Lorraine without Ross standing between them. But Ross took all of that. He took her future because he feared losing his present. He took her life because he couldn't bear to lose control. Lord Wist asked Ross how he lived with his conscience. It's a question that haunts this story, because Ross never showed remorse. Not during the investigation. Not during the trial. Not after his conviction. He maintained his innocence even when the evidence was insurmountable. Even when text messages and credit card statements and CCTV footage and the location of his mother's hidden body all pointed to him. Even when a jury of his peers unanimously found him guilty. That level of denial suggests something profound about Ross Taggart's psychology. Either he truly cannot process what he did, his mind unable to accept the enormity of his crime, or he simply doesn't care, which suggests a level of selfishness and lack of empathy that borders on sociopathy. The manipulation, the coercive control, the ability to lie so consistently, the lack of remorse. These are all markers of someone profoundly disconnected from normal human emotion. Ross spent years learning that he could use his mother's love as a weapon. He learned that tears and promises and manipulation would always work on Carol, that she would always forgive, always give another chance, always choose him. Until the moment she finally didn't, and that was when he killed her. Carol Taggart's story is tragic, but it teaches us something important about the nature of love and control. Unconditional love is beautiful. It's what allows parents to raise children, to forgive mistakes, to support growth even when it's hard. But unconditional love without boundaries becomes enabling, and enabling can be deadly. Carol loved Ross unconditionally. She chose him over her relationship with Lorraine. She chose him over her relationship with Lorraine's father. She changed her will for him. She let him live with her, depend on her, control her life. All because she believed that love would be enough. But love wasn't enough. Because Ross didn't want love. He wanted control. He wanted money. He wanted comfort without responsibility. And Carol's love, boundless and forgiving as it was, simply gave him more tools to manipulate her. This doesn't mean Carol is to blame. She is the victim. Ross is the perpetrator. But Carol's story reminds us that love must sometimes come with boundaries. That enabling harmful behavior doesn't help the person we love. It allows them to sink deeper into their worst selves. Lorraine saw this. She tried to maintain distance from Ross's chaos. But she lost her mother in the process because Carol couldn't set those boundaries. Carol couldn't say no. Carol couldn't cut Ross off, even temporarily. Even when it might have saved them both. Picture Carol Taggart before that December night. Picture her in her home, surrounded by toys and children's laughter. Picture her making snacks, wiping tears, teaching little ones to tie their shoes. Picture her with that purple rose on her wrist, visible as she reached out to comfort a crying child or steady a toddler learning to walk. Picture her in quiet moments too, drinking tea, looking out the window at the Scottish sky. Maybe wondering what went wrong with Ross. Maybe hoping tomorrow would be different. Maybe planning for a future she'd never see. Carol lived 54 years. She raised children. She ran a business. She loved and was loved. She made mistakes, as we all do. She trusted too much, forgave too easily, held on when she should have let go. But these weren't crime. These were the actions of someone who believed in redemption, in family, in second chances. Ross Taggart took all of that away in one night of violence. He took her past, her present, and her future. He took memories from Lorraine. He took a partner from Sean. He took a beloved childminder from the community. But he didn't take Carol's impact. That remains. In the law that now bears her story. In the families who signed petitions. In the people who remember her kindness. And her daughter who fights on. Carol Taggart matters. Her life matters. And now so does her death. Because it changed something. It made the world slightly safer for the next family. The next victim, the next person betrayed by someone they love. And so we come to the end of Carol Taggart's story. A story of a mother who loved too much and a son who loved too little. A story of manipulation and murder, and the long fight for justice that followed. Tomorrow you might forget some of these details. The exact dates might blur, the names might fade. But remember this, love requires boundaries. Trust must be earned. And sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we should watch most carefully. Not because the world is full of Ross Taggarts. Most people are good. Most family members love without ulterior motives. Most children would never harm their parents. But some do. And Carol's story reminds us that it can happen to anyone. It can happen in a small Scottish town. It can happen in a home filled with children's toys. It can happen to someone kind and giving and beloved. The purple rose on Carol's wrist is gone now, along with everything else. But the memory of Carol Taggart remains. In Lorraine. In the changed law. In this story being told. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight we're going to explore a case that unfolded in the glamorous hills of Los Angeles, where success and ambition cast long shadows, and where trust between two people who had built a life together would be shattered in the most tragic way imaginable. This is the story of Fabio Cementilli, a man whose hands created beauty, whose talent elevated him from humble beginnings to the pinnacle of his profession. And this is also the story of how that life ended, one January evening in 2017, in a quiet backyard in the Woodland Hills neighborhood of Los Angeles. Fabio Cementilli was born in Argentina, a country known for its passion, its culture, its deep appreciation for beauty and style. From an early age, Fabio understood the transformative power of appearance, how the right haircut could change the way someone carried themselves through the world. He was drawn to the art of hairstyling, not just as a trade, but as a calling. By the time Fabio reached his 20s, his talent had already begun to open doors. He didn't just cut hair. He understood structure, texture, movement. He could see the potential in each client who sat in his chair, could envision what they might become with the right touch. This gift would take him far beyond the borders of his birthplace. Fabio's career ascended in the way dreams are supposed to unfold. He became a platform artist and educator for Wella Professionals, one of the most prestigious names in the global beauty industry. This wasn't simply a job, it was a position of influence. As a platform artist, Fabio traveled the world, standing before audiences of fellow hairstylists, demonstrating techniques, sharing his vision of beauty, inspiring others in his craft. His client list read like the pages of celebrity magazines. Jennifer Lopez sat in his chair. So did Selena Gomez. These weren't just appointments, they were collaborations with some of the most photographed faces in the world. When you style hair for people whose images appear on magazine covers, on red carpets, on screens around the globe, every cut matters. Every style is scrutinized. Fabio thrived under this pressure. But perhaps more importantly than his celebrity connections, Fabio was known for his warmth. Colleagues described him as generous with his knowledge, never threatened by other talented stylists, always willing to mentor, to teach, to lift others up. In an industry that could be competitive and cutthroat, Fabio stood out for his genuine kindness. He had built something else too. A family. Fabio had been married to Monica Cementilli for decades. Together they had raised a daughter. They lived in a beautiful home in Woodland Hills, a neighborhood nestled in the southern foothills of the Santa Monica Mountains. The area was known for its winding streets, its privacy, its sense of security. Homes here weren't modest. They spoke of success, of lives well lived. From the outside, Fabio's life appeared to be the culmination of everything one might work toward: professional recognition, financial comfort, a family, a home. The dream, as they say, realized. But as we know from so many stories like this one, appearances can be deceiving. The life that seems perfect from the outside can harbor secrets, resentments, plans made in darkness. January 18th, 2017, began as an ordinary Wednesday. Fabio went about his day, likely with appointments scheduled, perhaps travel plans in the works. At 54 years old, he was at the height of his career, still in demand, still creating. That evening, Monica Cementilli left the house. She had plans, she would later tell investigators. She went to dinner with a friend. This was not unusual. After so many years of marriage, couples often maintain their own social lives, their own rhythms. Monica went out, Fabio stayed home. The neighborhood was quiet that night. Woodland Hills doesn't have the bustling energy of downtown Los Angeles. Here, houses are separated by gates and hedges, by professionally landscaped yards and privacy fences. Neighbors might go days without seeing each other, even when living just next door. According to the timeline that would later be established, Monica returned home around 9:45 in the evening. She pulled into the driveway of their home on the 3400 block of Avenida Colada. The street name itself, Avenida Colada, translates roughly to Avenue of Silence, an ironic detail given what had occurred there. Monica would later tell police that when she entered the house, she called out for Fabio. The house was dark in places, lit in others. She called his name again. No response. She moved through the rooms, through the home they had shared for so long. Still no sign of her husband. Then she went to the backyard. What Monica found there would shatter the quiet of that January night. Fabio was lying face down near the pool. Even from a distance, even in the dim light of the backyard, she could see something was terribly wrong. She rushed to him. Blood. So much blood. Monica called 911. The recording of that call would later become evidence. Her voice frantic, desperate. She was performing CPR, she told the dispatcher, trying to breathe life back into the man she had been married to for so many years. But some things cannot be undone. When the Los Angeles Police Department arrived at the Woodland Hills home, they found a scene that would be seared into their memories. Fabio Cementilli had been stabbed. But this wasn't a single wound. This wasn't a momentary altercation that went too far. Fabio had been stabbed over 30 times. His throat had been slashed so deeply that he was nearly decapitated. This was fury. This was rage made physical. This was overkill. A term investigators use when a victim is attacked far beyond what would be necessary to cause death. Overkill often suggests something personal. It suggests emotion. The backyard showed signs of struggle. This hadn't been quick. Fabio had fought. He was a fit man, athletic, and he had clearly tried to defend himself, but against a determined attacker or perhaps multiple attackers. With knives, he had no chance. Investigators began their work with the careful attention that every homicide demands. They photographed the scene from every angle. They collected evidence documenting blood spatter patterns, the position of the body, every detail that might later prove significant. They searched the house, the yard, the surrounding area. One of the first questions in any murder investigation is simple but crucial. Who benefits? In cases where someone is killed in their own home, investigators typically start with the closest circle: family members, business partners, anyone who might have a motive. Monica Cementilli became a focus immediately, not because she had necessarily done anything to warrant suspicion, but because she was the spouse, and statistically, when someone is murdered in their home, the person who lives with them knows something about why. When Monica told investigators about her evening, she had been at dinner with a friend. She had an alibi. She had returned home to find her husband dead. She was devastated, distraught. She had lost her partner of decades. But as detectives dug deeper into the Cementilli marriage, a different picture began to emerge. A picture that Monica hadn't mentioned in those first frantic hours after finding her husband's body. Within days of Fabio's death, investigators learned something significant. Monica Cementilli had been having an affair. This in itself wasn't necessarily suspicious. Affairs are common, and they don't typically lead to murder. But the details of this particular affair would prove crucial. The man Monica had been involved with was named Robert Louis Baker. He was in his 40s, 10 years younger than Monica. He was a racquetball coach, someone who moved in very different circles than the high-end beauty industry that had been Fabio's world. Racquetball had once been tremendously popular in America, reaching its peak in the 1980s and 90s. By 2017, it was a niche sport, played in clubs and recreational facilities, no longer commanding the mainstream attention it once had. Robert Baker made his living teaching this sport, coaching players, running clinics. Monica had apparently met Baker through the racquetball community. The affair had been going on for some time. Exactly how long would become a matter of investigation, but it was clear this wasn't a brief indiscretion. This was a relationship that had developed depth, had developed complications. Investigators interviewed Baker. They asked him about his relationship with Monica. They asked him where he had been on the night of January 18th. Baker, like Monica, had an alibi. He had not been at the Cementilli home that night. He had been elsewhere, and this could be verified. But having an alibi doesn't always mean innocence. Sometimes the person who stands to gain from a murder is smart enough not to be the one holding the knife. As detectives continued their investigation, they began to develop a theory. What if this wasn't a random attack? What if this wasn't a robbery gone wrong? What if someone had been hired to kill Fabio Cementilli? The evidence supported this possibility. Nothing had been taken from the home. This wasn't a burglary. The attack had occurred in the backyard, suggesting the killer or killers had waited for Fabio there or had followed him outside. The sheer brutality suggested either personal rage or an attempt to ensure the job was finished. Investigators started looking into Robert Baker's background, his associates, his phone records. They were looking for connections, for communications, for anything that might suggest he had reached out to someone who could do what he allegedly could not do himself. That's when they found Christopher Ely Austin. Christopher Austin was from Oregon, a fact that would seem to place him far from the sun-soaked violence of that Woodland Hills backyard. But as investigators would discover, distance means little when murder is being planned. Austin was in his 30s, and like Baker, he was involved in athletics. He was a parole officer and worked with the Oregon Department of Corrections. This detail is particularly striking. Here was a man whose job was to monitor people who had been convicted of crimes to ensure they were following the conditions of their release, to prevent them from reoffending. And yet, according to the prosecution's theory, he had allegedly been willing to commit one of the most serious crimes possible. The connection between Baker and Austin went back years. They knew each other through racquetball. They had competed together, practiced together. They were friends, or at least friendly enough that when one allegedly needed help with something terrible, the other allegedly agreed. Phone records would become crucial evidence. In the days leading up to Fabio's murder, there had been communications between Baker and Austin. After the murder, there were more communications. The pattern suggested coordination, planning, perhaps even payments. Investigators also discovered that Austin had traveled to California around the time of the murder. He had flown down from Oregon. He had been in the Los Angeles area on January 18th. Alibi, or lack thereof, would be scrutinized. The theory that prosecutors would eventually present was this. Monica Cementilli and Robert Baker wanted Fabio dead. Perhaps they wanted to be together without the complication of a divorce. Perhaps there was money involved. Fabio was successful, and in California, a community property state, a divorce would mean splitting assets accumulated during the marriage. Whatever the motive. According to prosecutors, Baker reached out to his friend Christopher Austin, and Austin allegedly agreed to make the trip to California to kill a man he had never met, a man who had done nothing to him, simply because his friend asked. On the evening of January 18th, while Monica was conveniently at dinner with a friend, establishing her alibi, Austin allegedly entered the Cementilli property and waited. When Fabio came outside, perhaps to check something in the yard, perhaps drawn out by a noise, Austin allegedly attacked. The brutality of the attack, the overkill, might suggest Austin wanted to ensure Fabio was dead. Or perhaps in the moment something took over. Some combination of adrenaline and violence that once started became impossible to stop. After the murder, Austin allegedly left the scene. He would eventually return to Oregon, perhaps believing he had gotten away with it, that the distance between states would protect him. But modern investigations don't respect state borders. Evidence can be gathered from anywhere. Phone records, financial transactions, travel records, they all leave trails. The investigation into Fabio Cementilli's murder took time. These cases always do. Prosecutors needed more than just a theory. They needed evidence that could convince a jury, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Monica Cementilli, Robert Baker, and Christopher Austin had conspired to commit murder. The Los Angeles Police Department worked with prosecutors to build their case piece by piece. Phone records showing communications between the three defendants. Financial records that might show payments. Travel records proving Austin was in California at the time of the murder. Testimony from people who knew about the affair, who might have heard something suspicious, who could place these people together. There was also the crime scene itself. Forensic evidence would be analyzed and reanalyzed. Blood spatter patterns could tell a story about how the attack unfolded. The wounds on Fabio's body could tell investigators about the weapon used, about the position of attacker and victim. In cases involving conspiracy, prosecutors often face a challenge. It's not enough to prove that a murder happened. They must prove that multiple people planned it together, that there was agreement, that each person played a role. This requires showing communication, coordination, motive. For Monica, the motive seemed clear enough. She was married to Fabio, but involved with Baker. A divorce would be expensive and complicated. If Fabio died, she would inherit his assets. She would be free to be with Baker without the messiness of separation. For Baker, the motive was presumably Monica herself, and perhaps the financial benefits that might come from being with a widow rather than a divorced woman. But convincing someone else to commit murder requires more than just desire. It requires persuasion, planning, and likely payment. For Austin, the motive was less obvious to outsiders. Why would a parole officer from Oregon fly to California to kill a man he didn't know? Prosecutors would suggest it was a favor to a friend, possibly combined with financial compensation. The exact details would have to be presented at trial. The arrests, when they finally came, were dramatic. Monica Cementilli was arrested in November of 2017, nearly 10 months after her husband's death. She was charged with murder, with prosecutors alleging she had conspired with others to kill Fabio. Robert Baker was arrested shortly thereafter. The charges against him were the same: murder, conspiracy to commit murder. He had allegedly orchestrated the killing, reaching out to Austin to do what he himself could not or would not do. Christopher Austin was arrested in Oregon. Despite the distance, despite his position as a parole officer, despite whatever he might have thought about his chances of getting away with this, the evidence had caught up with him. He was extradited to California to face charges. All three defendants pleaded not guilty. They were each facing life in prison if convicted. Monica, who had called 911 in apparent distress, who had seemed to be a grieving widow, was now sitting in a jail cell accused of arranging her husband's death. The legal proceedings would take years. Murder trials often do, especially when multiple defendants are involved, when the evidence is complex, when so much is at stake. There were motions filed, evidence challenged, witness lists compiled. The Cementilli case attracted attention, not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the people involved. Fabio had been well known in the beauty industry. His murder had sent shockwaves through that community. People who had worked with him, who had considered him a friend, struggled to understand how his life had ended so violently. And there was the larger question that always haunts cases like this: how does someone kill a person they once loved? If the prosecution's theory was correct, Monica had spent decades with Fabio. They had built a life together, raised a child together. How does love, or whatever remains of love, transform into something that allows you to plan another person's death? The trials of Monica Cementilli, Robert Baker, and Christopher Austin would unfold separately, each defendant facing their own day in court. Christopher Austin's trial came first, in October of 2019. Nearly 3 years after Fabio's murder, Austin sat in a Los Angeles courtroom as prosecutors laid out their case. They presented phone records showing communications with Baker in the days around the murder. They presented travel records showing Austin had been in California at the time. They presented testimony suggesting Austin had the opportunity, and according to the prosecution, he had the willingness to commit this crime for his friend. The defense argued Austin was innocent, that the evidence was circumstantial, that being in California didn't prove he had killed anyone, but the jury was convinced. After deliberating, they found Christopher Austin guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction of Austin was significant. It meant that prosecutors had convinced a jury that Fabio had not been killed in some random attack, but that someone had specifically traveled to California to murder him. This strengthened the case against the other defendants, suggesting there had indeed been a conspiracy. Robert Baker's trial followed. Baker was accused of being the mastermind, the one who had reached out to Austin, who had set the murder in motion. The prosecution presented evidence of the affair with Monica, of communications with Austin, of the relationship between all three defendants. Baker maintained his innocence. His defense attorneys argued that the evidence didn't prove he had asked Austin to kill Fabio, that an affair didn't automatically lead to murder, that the prosecution's theory, while compelling, wasn't proven beyond reasonable doubt. But once again, the jury disagreed. Robert Louis Baker was found guilty of first-degree murder. Like Austin, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This left Monica Cementilli. Her trial was perhaps the most emotionally complex. Here was a woman who had called 911, who had performed CPR on her dying husband, who had appeared to be a devastated widow. The prosecution would argue this was all performance, that she had known exactly what would happen when she left the house that night, that she had created her alibi deliberately. Monica's defense team faced a significant challenge. Two men had already been convicted of killing her husband. The jury would know this. The question wasn't whether Fabio had been murdered, or even who had physically committed the murder. The question was whether Monica had been part of the conspiracy. The prosecution presented evidence of the affair with Baker. They presented testimony suggesting Monica's marriage to Fabio had been troubled, that she had wanted out, that divorce wasn't the solution she had chosen. They presented evidence of communications between Monica and Baker, suggesting coordination. Monica's defense argued she had nothing to do with her husband's murder, that she had been as shocked as anyone to find him dead in their backyard, that having an affair didn't make her a murderer. They suggested that perhaps Baker and Austin had acted on their own, without her knowledge or consent. But the jury, after hearing all the evidence, after deliberating on the testimony and the phone records and the timeline of that terrible night, reached a verdict. Monica Cementilli was found guilty of first-degree murder. In April of 2023, 6 years after Fabio's death, Monica was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. All three defendants are currently serving life sentences. They have filed appeals, as most convicted defendants do, arguing that errors were made during their trials, that evidence was improperly admitted or excluded, that their constitutional rights were violated in some way. These appeals are still working their way through the system. Fabio Cementilli's daughter was left to process an impossible situation. Her father was dead, murdered. Her mother was convicted of arranging his death. The family she had known no longer existed in any recognizable form. The beauty industry mourned Fabio in the way creative communities mourn their own. Colleagues shared stories of his generosity, his talent, his kindness. Wella professionals issued statements honoring his contributions. Hairstylists who had learned from him, who had been inspired by his work, posted tributes. But beyond the professional accolades, there was a simpler truth. A man who had created beauty in the world, who had worked with his hands to help people feel more confident, more themselves, had died violently in his own backyard, allegedly at the hands of someone he trusted most. The case raises questions that don't have easy answers. How well do we really know the people we live with? What happens in a marriage when love fades, but convenience remains? At what point does fantasy about a different life transform into action to make that fantasy real? For Monica, Robert, and Christopher, whatever they thought might happen after Fabio's death, whatever life they imagined, none of it came to pass. Instead of freedom, they found prison. Instead of a future together, they found separate cells and separate appeals. And Fabio, who had traveled the world sharing his craft, who had touched the lives of so many through his work and his warmth, became another statistic in Los Angeles' homicide records. Another life cut short. Another family destroyed. As you lie here in the darkness, perhaps on the edge of sleep, consider how thin the line can be between the life we show the world and the life we hide. Fabio appeared to have everything. Success, recognition, a home, a family. And yet, beneath the surface, there were currents moving that he may never have fully understood. The investigators who worked this case have moved on to others. Los Angeles sees over 200 homicides in an average year. Each one represents a life ended, a family shattered, a mystery to be solved. The detectives who stood in that Woodland Hills backyard, who documented every drop of blood and every stab wound, have seen things most of us cannot imagine. And still they do their work, building cases, seeking justice, trying to bring some small measure of order to chaos. The jury members who convicted Monica, Robert, and Christopher have returned to their lives. They listened to weeks of testimony, saw graphic photos from the crime scene, heard Monica's 911 call. They carried the weight of deciding whether 3 people would spend the rest of their lives in prison. That responsibility stays with you. And somewhere in California prisons, 3 people wake up each day to the reality of what they did, or what they were convicted of doing. They eat meals in dining halls. They follow routines. They live in spaces measured in feet, not yards. Whatever freedom they once enjoyed, whatever future they imagined, it ended when those guilty verdicts were read. The house on Avenida Colliada still stands. Someone else lives there now, most likely. The backyard where Fabio died has been cleaned, the blood washed away, the evidence collected and cataloged. Life continues, as it always does, indifferent to tragedy. But for those who knew Fabio, for the colleagues who worked beside him, for the clients who sat in his chair, for the stylists he mentored, the loss remains. Talent like his doesn't come along often. Kindness like his is rare enough that people notice its absence. This is the story of Fabio Cementilli, who came from Argentina with dreams of success and achieved them beyond what most people ever do, who built a career on artistry and skill, who was, by all accounts, a good man trying to live a good life. And this is the story of how that life ended, allegedly at the hands of people who should have protected him, who should have honored the bonds of friendship and marriage, who instead chose violence. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded over more than 2 decades. A story of a quiet life interrupted, of questions that lingered in the dark, and of the sun's unwavering determination to find truth. This is a story that asks us to consider the nature of justice, the weight of time, and the shadows that sometimes fall across the most ordinary of days. This is the story of Andrea Simcata. In the mid-1990s, in the suburban comfort of Arlington, Virginia, there lived a woman whose life was built around books, knowledge, and quiet service to her community. Andrea Simcata was 52 years old, and she had spent years as a reference librarian at the Arlington Central Library. If you've ever walked into a library with a question, any question at all, you understand the particular gift that reference librarians possess. They are guides through the wilderness of information, patient and knowledgeable, helping strangers find answers to questions both profound and mundane. Andrea's world extended beyond the library's walls. She was a devoted mother to her son, Kevin, who was 24 years old in 1998. Though Andrea had divorced Kevin's father, Howard, years earlier, they maintained a cordial relationship for their son's sake. Kevin had moved into his own place in March of 1997, but he remained close to his mother, visiting her regularly for Sunday evening dinners. These were the simple rituals that bound them together, the passing of plates, the sharing of stories, the comfort of familiar company. By this time, Andrea had found love again. For 7 years, she had been with James Christopher Johnson, known to friends and family as Chris. He worked at Home Depot, and he and Andrea shared an apartment in the Colonial Village neighborhood, a modest complex along North Road Street. Together, they were building something more, a vacation property on the Rappahannock River in Lancaster, Virginia. They called it simply the Beach House, a place where future memories would be made, where the water lapped against the shore and time moved more slowly. Andrea had her routines. In the mornings before the world fully woke, she would swim laps at Washington Lee High School. The water was her meditation, the steady rhythm of stroke after stroke, breath after breath. She would return home, prepare for her day, and head to the library where books waited to be cataloged, questions waited to be answered, and patrons waited for her gentle expertise. It was a quiet life, a good life, the kind that unfolds in the background of more dramatic stories, the kind that seems from the outside unremarkable in its contentment. But in August of 1998, that quiet life came to a sudden, violent end. August 21st, 1998, began like many summer days in Virginia, warm, humid, the kind of day where the air itself seems to press down on you. Andrea followed her usual routine. She went for her morning swim. She had plans to meet a friend for lunch, and later she and Chris were going to watch a movie together. These were small plans, the kind we make without thinking, assuming there will always be time, always be tomorrow. But Andrea never made it to that lunch appointment. When Chris Johnson returned home from work that evening, he noticed something unusual. Andrea's car was missing. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt wrong, the kind of silence that has weight to it. He called out for her. No answer. He moved through the rooms, checking, searching, the unease growing with each empty space. It wasn't until much later, 7.5 hours after he arrived home, to be precise, that Chris called 911. The timestamp on that call was 1:37 in the morning on August 22nd. The recording of that call would later become a subject of intense scrutiny, analyzed and reanalyzed, every word weighted with meaning. I thought my girlfriend was missing, Chris explained to the dispatcher, his voice measured, controlled. I hadn't seen her. He described how he had been doing laundry, moving back and forth past the bedroom closet. He mentioned the mundane details of his evening, the clothes he washed, the tasks he completed. It took him 35 seconds to state what the emergency was. And when he finally opened the closet door, there she was. Andrea Sincata had been strangled. Her body had been placed in the bedroom closet, hidden from view. There was blood, copious amounts of it, as investigators would later note, covering her face. The scene was devastating, violent, a stark contrast to the life of quiet service she had led. The police arrived and began their investigation. There was no forced entry to the apartment, no obvious signs of a struggle in the main living areas. Andrea's will, which had been kept in a filing cabinet that Chris knew about, was missing. A jar of coins was gone. Her Honda Civic hatchback had vanished. From the very beginning, Chris Johnson became a person of interest. This is not unusual in such cases. Statistically, when a woman is killed, the partner is often involved. But statistics are not evidence, and suspicion is not proof. The police brought Chris in for questioning, and over the course of 3 days, they interviewed him for a total of 28 hours. During those long sessions, Chris eventually provided what he called a vision statement. In this statement, he described an argument with Andrea over a t-shirt related to pornography. He said he had accidentally hit her on the head, causing her to strike the corner of a desk. He described holding her upward, attempting to help her, but realizing she was already gone. He said he straddled her body trying to perform CPR. And then, in a moment of panic or confusion, he moved her body into the closet. He also mentioned the other details of his evening. Doing laundry, throwing away soda bottles, sitting on the floor and drinking the last root beer before discarding that bottle too. These details, small and specific, would echo through the years to come. But there was a problem with Chris's vision statement. The medical examiner ruled Andrea's death a homicide by strangulation. There was no evidence of an accidental fall, no injury consistent with hitting a desk corner, and so, despite the hours of interrogation, despite the suspicions, the police did not have enough to charge Chris Johnson. The investigation turned to other possibilities. Kevin Sincata provided investigators with a crucial lead. He remembered his mother telling him about giving away her old computer. About 3 weeks before her death, Andrea had noticed a truck outside her apartment building. The truck bore the label Trash Masters. The man driving it was doing maintenance work around the complex. Andrea, seeing an opportunity to dispose of her unwanted computer, approached him and offered it to him. This was not like Andrea. Both Kevin and Chris would later note that Andrea was not the type to invite strangers into her home. She was careful, perhaps even a bit reserved. But on that day, she had allowed this maintenance worker into the apartment to collect the computer. He had seen the layout of the home. He knew where things were. He had been given Andrea's name and phone number, and she had his. The police tracked down this man relatively quickly. His name was Bobby Joe Leonard. When they found him, Leonard was in a Philadelphia jail, arrested for assaulting his wife just days after Andrea's murder. The charges would later be dropped, but Leonard remained in custody. Virginia investigators traveled to Philadelphia to question him. They took his DNA, they took his fingerprints, and Leonard denied any involvement in Andrea's death. His DNA and fingerprints were not found at the crime scene. To the investigators, this seemed to clear him. They moved on, focusing their attention back on Chris Johnson. But the evidence remained circumstantial, and without concrete proof, the case grew cold. Kevin Sincata, however, did not forget about Bobby Joe Leonard, the computer guy. The stranger his mother had unwisely allowed into their home. As the years passed and Andrea's case remained unsolved, Kevin attended Leonard's trial for another crime. In 1999, less than a year after Andrea's death, Bobby Joe Leonard was arrested again. This time, the charge was far more serious. He had kidnapped, raped, and attempted to murder a 13-year-old girl. The attack was brutal. He had strangled her with his bare hands and left her for dead in a closet. The parallels to Andrea's case were chilling. The strangulation, the closet, the violence of it all. But the girl survived. She was brave enough to identify Leonard, and in the year 2000 he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 30 years. Bobby Joe Leonard, it turned out, had a long criminal history. By the time he was 30 years old, he had accumulated more than a dozen felony convictions. Armed robbery, assault, forcible sodomy. He had spent much of his adult life moving in and out of prison. Kevin attended Leonard's sentencing hearing, hoping to understand, to find some connection to his mother's case. Many of Andrea's friends and family were there that day. Chris Johnson was not. And so the years passed. 2000 became 2005. Then 2010. Andrea's case file gathered dust. Kevin continued to push for answers to keep his mother's memory alive. But the investigation had stalled. The leads had run dry. The trail had gone cold. Until 2013. In 2013, at Kevin Sincata's persistent urging, the Arlington County Police Department's cold case unit took another look at Andrea's murder. Fresh eyes reviewed the old files, examined the evidence, spoke to witnesses whose memories had been crystallized by time. 5 years later, in 2018, a new detective was assigned to the case. Her name was Rosa Ortiz. Detective Ortiz approached the investigation with renewed determination. She reviewed everything: the crime scene photos, the forensic reports, the interview transcripts, and she decided to visit Bobby Joe Leonard in prison. Leonard had been behind bars for nearly 2 decades at this point. He was 54 years old, his life sentence stretching ahead of him with no hope of release. And something had changed in him, or so he claimed. He told Detective Ortiz that he had found God, that he wanted to confess, that he wanted to tell the truth about what happened to Andrea Sincata. What Leonard revealed was shocking. Yes, he admitted he had killed Andrea. He had returned to her apartment on that August day in 1998, when she offered him something cold to drink in the summer heat. He had followed her inside, and as she reached out to hand him the soda, he reached out with both hands and grabbed her by the throat. He squeezed until she stopped moving, until she lay still on the ground. He described it in disturbing detail. He said there was no struggle, no fight, though the autopsy had shown evidence of defensive wounds, of Andrea fighting for her life. Leonard's account of a passive victim did not match the physical evidence, but he told his story nonetheless. He stole a jar of coins. He took Andrea's purse. He took her car keys and drove away in her Honda Civic, abandoning it along Interstate 295 when it broke down. He fled to Philadelphia to stay with his ex-wife, which is where the assault took place that landed him in jail days later. But Leonard's confession contained something more, something that would resurrect the investigation and pull Chris Johnson back into the spotlight. Leonard claimed he had not acted alone. He said he had received phone calls before the murder, multiple calls from someone he believed to be Andrea's boyfriend, an older white man who sounded educated, who spoke like an engineer. This caller, Leonard said, had offered him $5,000 to kill Andrea. The money would be waiting in the bedroom closet. All Leonard had to do was commit the murder. Of course, when Leonard entered that closet after killing Andrea, there was no money, no $5,000, just a body and a broken promise. And Leonard, already a suspect in Andrea's death, and then quickly imprisoned for his attack on the teenager, never tried to collect his payment. Detective Ortiz took this information to prosecutors. The question was whether to believe a man with 13 prior felony convictions, a man serving life in prison for one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, a man who had violently attacked multiple women throughout his life. But Leonard provided details that seemed to corroborate his story. He described receiving a call from Andrea's number, with a man on the other end who claimed to know about Leonard's criminal history. The caller had said something to the effect of, "I know you've been locked up a few times. I know you've been in trouble." Leonard claimed the man was reading from his criminal record, that this knowledge gave the caller confidence Leonard could be bought. Leonard also mentioned a detail about the crime scene, an unopened bottle of root beer left on the floor. Chris Johnson, in his statements to police back in 1998, had specifically mentioned sitting on the floor and drinking the last root beer before throwing the bottle away. He had mentioned throwing away other soda bottles that evening as well. Was this a coincidence? Or had Leonard truly spoken to someone who knew the intimate details of that apartment? Someone who knew what evidence needed to be cleaned up? There was more crime lab notes, indicated that a shoe print found on Andrea's body matched Chris Johnson's shoe with 15 or more conforming characteristics. The positioning of this print was consistent with someone straddling the body, perhaps attempting CPR, as Chris had described in his vision statement. But it was also consistent with someone committing an act of violence. And there were the phone records. Back in 1998, both Bobby Leonard and Chris Johnson had appeared to acknowledge speaking to each other in the days leading up to the murder. Chris now denied these calls ever took place, offering no explanation for his earlier statements. In November of 2021, a grand jury reviewed the evidence. They found probable cause. Both Bobby Joe Leonard and James Christopher Johnson were indicted on charges of aggravated murder, murder for hire. Bobby Joe Leonard, already serving life without parole, had little to lose. In July of 2022, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in Andrea's death. In exchange for his plea and his testimony against Chris Johnson, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. Leonard received another life sentence, to run consecutively with his existing sentence. Chris Johnson's trial began in September of 2022. The prosecution's case rested heavily on Leonard's testimony. On the stand, Leonard repeated his account. He described the phone calls from the older white man. He described being offered $5,000. He described the murder itself, the theft of Andrea's belongings, the abandoned car. But under cross-examination, Leonard's story began to unravel. The defense attorney, Manuel Leva, pointed out that Leonard had changed his story multiple times. When testifying before the grand jury, Leonard had never mentioned the caller discussing his criminal record. His ex-wife testified that they did not have caller ID on their home phone in 1998, contradicting Leonard's claim that he knew the call was from Andrea's number. Leonard admitted that he had violently choked multiple women around the same time period, in 1998 and 1999. He had done this without payment, without orders from anyone, simply because he was, in his own words, a very bad person. The defense argued that there was no physical evidence linking Leonard and Johnson to a murder for hire plot. No phone records, no financial transactions, no $5,000 withdrawn from any account. Too much time had passed to collect such records. Prosecutors admitted the case relied entirely on the word of a violent, convicted serial offender who had every reason to lie. Why would Leonard implicate Johnson if it wasn't true? The defense had an answer for that. Leonard, they claimed, hoped to be transferred from the high-security Wallens Ridge State Prison to a lower-security facility. While awaiting his testimony, Leonard had indeed requested such a transfer, and prosecutors had agreed to advocate for it. Kevin Sincata attended the trial every day. He had waited nearly 25 years for this moment. He wore a wire in 2018, meeting Chris for lunch, trying to elicit some kind of confession or admission. Chris had suspected something was wrong, had felt hurt by Kevin's questions, but had said nothing incriminating. Now in the courtroom, Kevin sat and listened as the evidence was presented. He heard Leonard's testimony. He saw the crime scene photos again, the images that had haunted him for decades. He waited for the jury to deliver justice. On October 4th, 2022, the jury retired to deliberate. They had heard days of testimony, had reviewed the evidence carefully. The prosecution had argued that while the case was circumstantial, Leonard's details and the physical evidence created a compelling picture of guilt. The defense had argued that Leonard was simply not credible, that the state was asking the jury to convict based on the word of a man who was by any measure a serial liar. The jury deliberated for 55 minutes. When they returned, they delivered a verdict of not guilty. Chris Johnson was acquitted of all charges. The jury foreman, a man named Chen Ling, spoke to the press afterward. "We saw the possibility that he did it," he said. But the probability wasn't enough. Kevin Sincata walked out of the courtroom with a look of profound disappointment. He thanked Detective Ortiz and Police Chief Andy Penn for their work, but he made it clear that he felt justice had been denied. He believed prosecutors had failed to present key evidence. He believed his mother's killer had gone free. Bobby Leonard received his second life sentence and was returned to prison, where he remains today, 57 years old, serving consecutive life terms in Sussex State Prison in Virginia. Chris Johnson, now a free man, went on with his life. He had married a woman named Ginny Grevitt during the years the case was cold. She had known about the investigation from their first date and had never doubted his innocence. Johnson told the press he was relieved, but that the experience had changed him forever. "You're never going to be the same," he said. "I used to be a lot more trusting." In 2023, Chris Johnson filed a lawsuit against Detective Rosa Ortiz, alleging that she had lied to the grand jury to obtain the indictment. The lawsuit claimed misconduct in the investigation. In March of 2024, that lawsuit was dismissed. And so we arrive at the end of this story. Though it is an ending without resolution, Andrea Sincata's case is officially closed. Bobby Leonard has been convicted of her murder, but the larger questions remain unanswered. Was there a conspiracy? Did Chris Johnson orchestrate his fiance's death, as Leonard claimed? Or is Bobby Leonard simply a violent criminal who, when given the opportunity to shift blame, invented a story that he hoped would earn him a transfer to a better prison? The shoe print on Andrea's body, was it left during an attempted act of resuscitation, or during an act of violence? The missing will, was it a calculated move by someone who stood to benefit, or simply an item lost in the chaos of the crime? The 7.5 hours that Chris spent at home before calling 911, was he in shock, as he claimed? Or was he cleaning up evidence? The root beer bottle that Leonard mentioned, was it proof they had communicated, or merely a detail that both men happened to notice independently? We cannot know with certainty. The jury heard the evidence and found reasonable doubt. That is the system working as it should. But doubt cuts both ways. It protects the innocent from wrongful conviction, and it sometimes allows the guilty to walk free. Kevin Sincata continues to seek answers. A website called Justice for Andrea Sincata documents the evidence in the case, presenting the information that Kevin believes proves Chris Johnson's involvement. The site includes forensic reports, witness statements, analysis of the 911 call, photographs of the crime scene. Kevin believes the full truth has not been told, and he is determined that his mother not be forgotten. As for Andrea herself, she remains a figure of quiet dignity in the story. A librarian who helped strangers find answers, a mother who raised her son with love, a woman who swam laps in the early morning light, and planned simple evenings with the person she thought she could trust. Her life was taken in an act of violence that shattered her family and left questions that may never be fully answered. Bobby Leonard will spend the rest of his life in prison for killing her. But whether he acted alone or at someone's behest, whether the man Andrea trusted betrayed her in the worst possible way, these questions remain suspended in the realm of possibility, rather than certainty. Sometimes true crime stories end with neat resolutions. The guilty are punished. The innocent are vindicated. Justice is served with clarity and precision, but more often these stories end in shades of gray, in verdicts that satisfy the letter of the law but not necessarily the human need for complete understanding. Andrea Sincata's story reminds us that real life is complex, that evidence can be ambiguous, that two people can look at the same facts and draw different conclusions. It reminds us that time is both a healer and an eraser, that memories fade and evidence degrades, that waiting 20 years for justice means some answers may be lost forever. And it reminds us of something else, that behind every true crime case is a real person whose life mattered. Andrea was not just a victim. She was a daughter, a mother, a friend, a colleague. She helped people find books. She swam in the morning. She planned beach houses and movie nights. She lived a life that, in its quiet way, touched others. The cases that keep us awake at night are often the ones that remain unresolved. The ones where we cannot quite put all the pieces together. But perhaps tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you can let the questions rest. You can hold space for both the certainty that Bobby Leonard strangled Andrea Sincata and the uncertainty about whether he acted at another's command. You can acknowledge Kevin's pain and his persistence. You can consider the jury's verdict and the weight of reasonable doubt. You can think about Detective Ortiz, who spent years trying to solve a cold case, and about Chris Johnson, who may be innocent or guilty but who certainly had his life upended by suspicion. And you can remember Andrea, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a person who deserved to grow old, to see her son flourish, to finish building that beach house by the river. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.